11-year-old Abigail Williams started to behave bizarrely. Soon, her 9-year-old cousin, Betty Paris, followed. The two other children in the Paris household showed no signs of odd behavior. The two girls, however, continued worsening, convulsing, howling, even throwing themselves across the room. No one was sure what to make of the sudden change in the girls. Soon other girls in the small village began to show the same symptoms. Samuel Parrish, who was the parish parson, soon would seek advice from like-minded men. The only logical conclusion they could reach is that the devil had come to Salem Village in 1692. I'm Mick Biddick, and welcome to a special History is Criminal. In this episode, we take a look at America's most famous case of witchcraft, the Salem Witch Trials. When a small village in Massachusetts starts to panic, that will cause neighbor to turn on neighbor, child to turn on parent, congregation on its preacher. It was not the first witch trials in America, and it wouldn't be the last, but it would be the most remarkable and best remembered. First and foremost, there were no witches, Wiccans, wizards, voodoo priestess, or demons in Salem Village. As Pulitzer Prize-winning author Stacy Schiff put in her book, The Witches of Salem, 1692, the early American witches had as much in common with the pointy-haired croons as Smalley pirates have with Captain Hook. These victims were not caricatures, nor were they a homogeneous group of simple-minded outcasts. While accusations started with 3 women who came from the lower caste of society, soon accusations would come from all strata of the Massachusetts, from beggars to the politically well-connected. Witchcraft accusations and counter-accusations flew like flies on horse crap. Long-standing feuds, petty property disputes, hell, wanted to get rid of a troublesome spouse? Settle it with a witchcraft trial. Having issues with someone? Let the authorities get rid of them for you. By the time it was all over, almost 200 people had been accused, including the wife of the governor. 20 were executed, and another 5 would die in prison awaiting their sentencing. How could all this insanity happen in a relatively short time? The trials started in February of 1692, and by June were ended. While Europe had its witch scares, for almost 300 years, Europeans had killed thousands, mostly women, for being witches. King James of England had even published a book in 1597, Demonology, that covered how to conduct a proper witch trial. But as the Enlightenment settled in across Europe, much of the continent had slowed, if not stopped, their witch hunting. So why would Salem Village and Massachusetts in general go completely off the rails in 1692? Salem Village was a small hamlet with a bunch of major beefs. Salem Village was struggling politically with Salem Town. Salem Town was at the time the second largest city in Massachusetts, had political control over the smaller Salem Village. Because Massachusetts Puritan settlements were established around parsonages, churches that is, and Salem had a large established parsonage, the people of Salem Village had to pay tax for the upkeep of the Salem parsonage. Men from the village had to serve in the militia of Salem, even though the village was far more exposed and vulnerable to attack than Salem Town. What the village needed was its own parsonage. Then they could break the hold Salem Town had on them. In 1673, Salem Village got their first minister, James Bailey. Bailey proved to be a much more divisive figure than the people of the village had hoped. Connected to the wealthy and powerful Putnam family by marriage, his running of the parsonage caused the village to split into 2 factions. While almost by unanimous consent, the town wanted their own parsonage to break away from Salem Town, they didn't seem to agree on the idea of paying for it. The parson's pay and upkeep of the parsonage fell victim to every personal and political grief that came from the village. By 1679, Bailey was out as a minister, but those who followed fared no better. When Samuel Parris arrived as a forest parson in 1689, he came to a parsonage that was split along party lines. The new minister had a young family: his wife, Elizabeth, son Thomas, age 10, Elizabeth, known as Betty, age 9, and 5-year-old Susanna. Also living in the Parris's home was his niece Abigail Williams and 2 slaves, Tituba and John. It was widely believed that Tituba and John were husband and wife and were of mixed ancestry, possibly Barbadian and African. Like all ministers in Puritan New England, his job was ruled by the local politics. When his pay was a little light or sometimes missing completely, which happened often, he was told something to the effect of, well, last sermon was also a little light. He was caught between supporters and opposition that was fueled by personal histories, economics, and petty jealousies. Salem Village was a lot like a junior high on steroids, but no teachers or principals to rein in the crazy. The people of Salem Village would be constantly watched. They watched for possible Indian attack, French or Spanish invasion. They watched each other and watched for the influence of the devil. To the Puritan mind of the 1600s, life was a continuous battle between the forces of God and the devil. They would be tried by both the Lord and Satan daily. The greater their holiness, the more likely the devil would try to sway them away from God. All had to keep guard. Any sign of influence of the devil was an indisputable danger to the settlement. The bewitchment of a single villager meant the downfall of all. The bewitching would start in Parris's own home. First, it was his niece Abigail. In January 1692, she started to have fits, complaining of pinching and grabbing by invisible forces. Shortly after, Parris's own 9-year-old daughter, Betty, started to show the same symptoms. The girls convulsed, howled, barked, spoke in tongues, threw themselves across her room. It was no secret what was happening in the Parris home. Abigail had even interrupted some sermons with her behavior. Members of the parsonage came to the Parris home to see the girls, partly out of idle curiosity and partly to see if they could lend any help. It's reported that many times so many people came to the home to witness the girls' actions that they couldn't all fit in the house. At one point, witnesses even claim a hairy winged creature appeared by the Parris's fireplace and then flew up the chimney. It is unclear if people pointed this out at the time or if this demonic presence was only spoken of in the past tense. The story seems to have been part of the confession of Tituba. Only after was it corroborated by others. One thing was clear: they needed help. Parris sought the wisdom of other nearby ministers. They recommended prayer and fasting. When scripture and hunger failed to help the girls, Parris called in the doctor. I use the term doctor very loosely here. The doctor who he called on was most likely William Griggs, a 71-year-old farmer who owned 9 medical texts. He could read, but reportedly could not write. No university-trained doctor lived in Salem or Salem Village at the time. In the colony, there were no schools of medicine in the colonies at all. Harvard, for the most part, educated ministers. A doctor carried a medical kit that had changed little since the times of ancient Greece. For the girl's sake, it might have been better if Dr. Griggs had no medical education. If he had, he might have prescribed a combination of mercury and arsenic, or a good old-fashioned bleeding. But Griggs wouldn't fall for any of that newfangled liberal science. He knew just the trouble. The girls were diagnosed with bewitchment. This was actually better than the other diagnosis of possession. If possessed, the girls were willing participants, but if they were bewitched, they were innocent victims. Now, the question became, who had bewitched them? Neither girl could come up with a name. It was important that the witch or witches be found. When the Parris family asked neighbor Mary Sibley to watch the girls one afternoon, Sibley decided to take action. A very pregnant Mary Sibley instructed Paris's slave John to make a witch cake by mixing the girl's urine with flour. The pea cake was then fed to a dog. The evil spirit should leave the girls, going into the dog. The dog pukes or poops out the evil spirit. The details of exactly how the witch cake works are a bit sketchy and conflicting depending on source. But the key is that once the cake is created and eaten by the dog, it'll allow the girls to name their tormentors. Ironically, this seems to be the only time that any type of magic was used in Salem Village. Paris, for his part, was pissed off when he found out what Mary did. In his mind, it was like inviting the devil to fight the devil. He was sure Mary had opened the door to more evil spirits. Paris even called Mary out in his next sermon, at which time she apologized and begged for forgiveness. The men of the parsonage voted to unanimously accept her apology and atonement. This was part of this whole everybody's watching thing. She actually would need the forgiveness of the congregation and the village as a whole, not just the forgiveness of Paris. It does seem, though, that the witch cake did its job. Just days after Mary Sibley's pea-infused cake, the girls named who had bewitched them: Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. Good was an outcast, a 38-year-old mother who was often homeless and begging. Her home life was so fractured that she and her 5-year-old daughter often lived away from their husbands, sleeping in barns and sheds. She was often unkept and combative, possibly suffering from some mental health issues, almost surely the victim of spousal abuse. In short, an easy target. The people of Salem Village had regularly complained about having to care for the poor, and Good was the most visible of the downtrodden. She would be the first interrogated. Osborne was around 50 and in poor health. She had a long-standing legal dispute with the Putnam family, her ex-in-laws. The dispute centered around a property left Osborne by her late husband. The fact that the Putnams were the most powerful family in the village, the biggest supporters of Paris's, and related to the Parises, didn't seem to matter. Good was arrested on the 29th of February and officially charged with bewitching and tormenting Abigail, Betty, and Elizabeth Hubbard. Hubbard was a 16-year-old orphan who lived as a servant in the house of Dr. Griggs. She'd be one of the most active accusers. Osborne was arrested and charged on the 1st of March. Good at first denied all charges of witchcraft, but later, facing possible torture, she confessed and pointed the finger at Osborne. Osborne, however, refused to name Good and refused to confess to any crimes. Soon other girls in Salem Village also were taken ill. Among those was Ann Putnam Jr. It would be Anne who would point the finger at Paris's slave, Tituba, on the 1st of March. Tituba was originally from Barbados. She had most likely served the Paris family on the island. On the surface, it would seem like she'd be the perfect person to accuse. As a slave, she'd be at the bottom of the social ladder. She'd be a person who would have little chance to defend herself. As easy as a target as you could find. However, it was actually rare for people of color, especially slaves, to be accused. After all, what would be the point of accusing a person who had nothing, therefore nothing to take? Why Anne accused Tituba, a loyal and well-liked slave, is unclear, but Tituba might have proven to be one of the smartest of the accused witches. Good proved to be a superb witch suspect. She had trouble with most of the families in the village. When she begged for a place to stay or other help, she would lash out at those who refused. She was also a bad house guest, which caused her to be kicked out of people's homes. When crossed, she cursed people. These curses were often just mumblings, but in Puritan society, mumbling was a sign that you had something to hide, maybe even something evil. So, when a family's cattle died after kicking her out, or a milk cow became sick after someone refused her help, or when the constable's brother's cows vanished. It would all be evidence of Good's witchery. Why Good turned in Osborne is unknown, but it was more than likely she was just trying to deflect from herself. Osborne was already in jail at the time, having been accused by Abigail and Betty. Osborne refused to name anyone at trial. She staunchly protested her innocence. By this time, the number of bewitched had grown, with other girls also naming Good and Osborne. The accusers played their parts well, convulsing, screaming in pain, complaining of phantom pinches each time the accused stood in court. It was a textbook bewitchment. It followed King James's description to the letter, complete with the admission of spectral evidence. Spectral evidence included dreams and visions, believing that witches could come to people in their dreams. The trial would change when Tituba took the stand. Tituba confessed to bewitching all the girls. Her story would have the entire village held spellbound. The devil had come to her in the form of a tall, white-haired man. With him were 4 others, Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and a woman and man from Boston who she did not know. They ordered her to torture the girls. If she refused, they would kill her. They would come to her several more times. Once they came in the form of 2 red cats, then 1 large black cat, then a large black dog, even coming to her as a hog. Osborne and Good also came to her often with a red cat. Good had also come to her once with a yellow bird and caused her to become deaf, so she couldn't hear the nightly family prayers led by Reverend Parris. The white-haired man had even told her once she could have the yellow bird if she did his bidding. She told how she traveled from house to house and even as far away as Boston to torment her victims. When asked how she traveled so quickly across the land, after all, a trip to Boston was an all-day affair, if not more. How did she manage to make the trip to Boston and back in one night without anyone noticing her absence? She told the court, quote, "I ride upon a sticker pole, and Good or Osborne behind me." Unquote. She told the court how Osborne had transformed into various beasts. It was Osborne that appeared as the hairy beast by the Paris' fire. Osborne had also transformed into a wolf that had stalked Elizabeth Hubbard. One evening, after the court adjourned for the night, Mary Hubbard, Samuel Sibley, Mary's husband, claimed that Good suddenly materialized before them standing on Sibley's dining table. Sibley struck at the vision with his walking stick, and then it vanished. Good, who was locked up with her daughter at the constable's home, as the jail did not have enough room for 3, that morning the constable's wife said a mark appeared on Good's arm, one where there hadn't been the night before. Within 24 hours, numerous people in the village reported Good coming to them at night, either as herself or in the form of an unknown cat or dog. But it would be Ann Putman who would name yet another witch. Ann claimed Dorothy Good, Sarah's 5-year-old daughter, came to her in the middle of the night and attacked her. Dorothy pinched, bit, and choked her, trying to force her to sign some diabolical form. Lead judge John Hawthorne brought up the idea that the accused had signed compacts with the devil. It was after Anne heard this that she told her story of the pint-sized witch attacking her. Hawthorne asked all 3 accused witches if the devil had presented a pact or contract with them. While Good and Osborne said no contract was presented, Tituba said one was presented to her. Tituba had refused to sign the letter. The devil later returned with the book. He was going to put her name in the book, but before he could, Mrs. Parris called Tituba to come to her, stopping her name from going in the book. But before the book was closed, she saw the names of Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne written in the book. While in custody, Good would confirm the mark was hers, but Osborne just laughed at the idea. Tituba was questioned 4 times, far more than any other accused witch during the trials. She said she wasn't a witch, but had worked for one. She was examined for witch marks. moles, freckles, blemishes, basically any mark on the skin. It seemed they had missed some at her first examination. It was clear she was a witch. But just then, she started to writhe in pain. She was being attacked by her former Confederates for turning against them. The 4 witches, counting the 5-year-old, were then moved to a Boston prison to stand for trial. What had happened up to this point was just the examination and gathering of evidence against the accused. With the witches safely in prison, Ann Putnam was again attacked, this time by a new tormentor. When Samuel Parris and another man showed up at Martha Corey's door on the 12th of March, she knew why they were there. She told the men she knew they were here to question her about being a witch. They took this as proof of her clairvoyance. Corey was a model church-going woman. Her only crime was that she had a mulatto son out of wedlock before her first marriage. She couldn't be arrested until after the Sabbath, so she sat in church with her accusers. This wouldn't be the last time that this situation played itself out in Salem Village or the whole of Essex County. The witch craze was spreading. More and more were accused. The examinations would follow a similar pattern. The accused was dragged before the assembly of learned men. Often, leading questions were presented to them in front of their accusers. Not only young girls, but more and more adults who had some stake in the trial's outcome. When elderly Rebecca Nurse threw her hands towards heaven, crying out, "Oh Lord, please help me," the girls convulsed and choked, throwing themselves on the ground. The adult witnesses joined in with Ann Putnam Sr., turning stiff as a board, and Mary Walcott, Ann's cousin, displaying bites and pinch marks. Hawthorne, who was at first skeptical of the accusations against Nurse, now saw that Nurse refused to cry, while many in the room wept with fear. He noted that it was a well-known fact that witches could not cry. This seems to have been one of the facts that came and went. Surely some of the convicted had to have cried, but her eyes were dry, which was more proof that she was a witch. Bridget Bishop would be the first to hang. While the examinations often took place in Salem Village meeting houses, once formally accused after the examination, the presumed witches would be moved to Boston to stand trial. The governor would create a special court, the growing number of cases. As the jails filled, a newly appointed king's attorney was assigned to try the criminal cases, Thomas Newton. It would be up to Newton to decide the order of the trials. And some suspects had been named by a confessed witch. He had a larger amount of spectral evidence presented by dozens of villagers and townsfolk. He even had Rebecca Nurse, who had, while invisible, tackled Ann Putnam Sr. The sickly, mostly deaf Nurse had apparently come flying in like an NFL linebacker and took out Putnam, who was less than half her age. Again, you just have to overlook the fact that Nurse's husband, Francis, had been part of the committee that had denied Parris's wages. But Newton would skip these and others to focus his first trial on Bridget Bishop. Bishop was a good first prosecution. Newton had to make sure his first trial was a win. He needed a slam dunk. Cotton Mather had started to interject himself into the witch hunting and was warning against the use of spectral evidence. Bishop had faced accusations of being a witch before and had a long history of run-ins with the authority. Her and her late husband often fought. She once appeared with bruises all over her body, another time with blood on her face. In 1677, she was hauled into the court for calling her husband a devil on the Sabbath. She had even been whipped for the same offense before. When her husband died, she ran into the conflict with her neighbors. While swimming in debt, she was charged with witchcraft. It was said she had spooked a horse, and a slave had saw a transparent bishop in the barn. Hawthorne said she had witched her first husband to death. She had been acquitted that time, but this time they would not let her walk away. Bishop was not from Salem, but had appeared to several villagers. Most damning was when her specter had approached Mary Walcott. Walcott's brother, had chased the specter away, plunging a sword at it. Mary said she had heard the cloth tear. When arrested, her coat was torn where Walcott said the sword had struck. At her examination, Bishop not only denied being a witch, but she stated she didn't even know what one was. To which Hawthorne replied, quote, "How can you know you are not a witch? Yet you know not what a witch is." When she told Hawthorne if she was a witch, he would know it, he took that as a threat. At the trial, there was no defense attorney. It was believed that an innocent could defend themselves while a guilty person would not be able to mount a defense. Bishop had numerous grudges with numerous people. Some of the accusers knew Bishop and had past troubles with her. Other Bishop had never met, not being from Salem Village. Her past petty thievery was introduced, as was the earlier charge of witchcraft. According to the testimony, she had a habit of popping into the young men's rooms at night to torment them. They told stories of fighting off the spectral bishop and seeing her on bended knees before a black man in a tall hat. There were no witnesses for the defense and no cross-examination of prosecution witnesses. She was found guilty to bewitching the girls whom she had never met, but not of the men who she actually had met. It mattered little, however. She was sentenced to death. Her trial was on the 2nd of June, her execution on the 10th. 18 others would follow her to the gallows, and one, Giles Corey, would be pressed to death by heavy stones. A total of 33 people would be convicted of being witches or wizards, essentially a male witch. Corey and his wife had both been accused of witchcraft. Martha was hanged, but Giles, who refused to cooperate with the examinations or trials, had created a problem for the authorities, so he'd have to be broken. On the 17th of September, he was staked to the ground, spread eagle, and had a plank put over his chest. Then heavy stones were piled on the plank. The law prescribed how the torture was to take place. Stones would be piled on him to the point he could not take it. Then more would be added. He was only to be fed on the first day, and that was with, quote, the worst bread. On the second day, he could be given 3 drinks of standing water from nearest the prison door. When he still refused to confess being a witch, he was excommunicated as a suicide. Near the end, his tongue poked out of his mouth, so Sheriff George Corwin used a stick to shove it back in his mouth. Corey died shortly after. That same day, Sheriff Corwin made a claim to Corey's land. With nearly 200 accused witches from across Massachusetts, but mostly from Essex County, people started to question if the trials were actually working to find witches. In January, a new court took over the trials, banning the use of spectral evidence. Then, Mary Spencer Phipps was accused of being a witch. She was the wife of the colony's governor, Sir William Phipps. The trials had thrown the colonies into chaos, impacting social and economic development of the colony. Some had questioned the fairness of the trials, and a handful of brave skeptics even began to speak out. With all this starting to pile up, the governor called an end to the trials. Were the 20 executed? Bridget Bishop, Rebecca Nurse, Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, Sarah Wilds, George Burroughs, Martha Carrier, John Willard, George Jacobs Sr., John Proctor, Martha Corey, Mary Estes, Sam Predator, Alice Parker, Mary Parker, Wilmot Reed, Margaret Scott, Samuel Wardwell, and Giles Corey are those who died in jail: Sarah Osborne, Roger Toothaker, Linda Dustin, Ann Foster, and some claim maybe 13 others. The governor's interjection of sanity came too late. The governor had those in prison released. Tituba, for her part, had spent nearly a year in jail. Her helpfulness in naming other witches made her too valuable to send to the gallows. The trials had ended. she and John, said to be her husband, were freed. They left Salem Village and disappeared from the historic record. The majority of the records from the trial were lost as Massachusetts seemed to want to erase the trials from memory. So it's estimated that somewhere between 145 and 185 people were accused, with 33 convicted, placing the conviction rate at somewhere around 20%. It wouldn't take long for the people of the colony to regret what they had done. Massachusetts would exonerate 22 of the 33 convicted witches in 1711 and agreed to pay the families of the convicted victims £600. Ann Putnam Jr. issued an apology for her part in the accusations in 1707. But it wasn't until 1957 that Massachusetts issued a formal apology for the trials. The last of the convictions overturned was Elizabeth Johnson Jr., who received a reprieve but not a pardon. She was officially pardoned in 2022. So what happened in 1692? Some like to claim ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that can grow on rye and has properties similar to LSD. Many researchers and historians had dismissed ergot as a cause. Part of it could have been a twisted bandwagon effect, not wanting to feel left out of the excitement that had become the focus of life in the colony. Surely a great deal of this was just a convenient way to settle old grudges. The Putmans and extended family, who were the center of the accusations, had a great deal to gain from many of the convictions. Some of it may have had to do with the basic structure of Puritan society. Anything out of the norm would be seen as a clear and present danger to the colony and would have to be removed. Even the position of young women and girls in Puritan society could have had an impact on the accusations. Young women would have been nearly invisible in the 1690s Puritan society. Making an accusation could have been a way to finally become the focus of attention. Sociologists, psychologists, and historians continue to struggle with the causes of the 1692 witch panic. The impact of the pandemic remains with us. Our language, popular culture, and imaginations. Salem Village, known as Danvers, ever since 1752, has leaned into this infamous bit of its history with a booming tourist industry built on the trials and witches. So the real crimes here are those committed by the false witnesses and society. 25 people died and nearly 200 had their lives turned upside down, accused of being something that doesn't even exist. Convicted on evidence that included dreams and imagined visions, the only punishment faced by those criminals was hopefully the tormented soul for having sent innocent people to their doom. And we may be a bit guilty ourselves as we degrade the victims to the cartoonish figments of fantasy, forgetting the victims were real flesh and blood people. This has been a special Halloween History is Criminal. Join us again in 2 weeks as we get back to our normal schedule of looking at the crimes and criminals from history.